John Andrews and Joan Hoey, who will be very familiar to regular attenders of our conferences here in Greece, just to set the context. And we have this very appropriate, I think, image behind me of the tightrope walker. We hope we won't fall off over the next 3 days here. But just to set the context, John, if I can turn to you first. John Andrews, some of you may be aware, literally wrote a book about the conflicts around the world, describing each one. So just put this in context for us, John. Where do we stand today in a world where we again have war in Europe, we have war in the Middle East?
Well, absolutely.
Tensions everywhere.
Yeah, there's always war. I mean, I think it was George Santayana who famously said, the only time you will not see war is when you're dead. So I think when I wrote that book, still available, of course, blah, 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 basically conflicts were between interstate actors. What is different now is that we have, for the first time, really since the Second World War, that we have conflicts between states. I mean, not entirely. I mean, there was a very brief conflict between Russia and Georgia, for example, in, I think, only 5 days in 2008. But now we have real battles between states. We have Russia against Ukraine. We have Israel against Iran. We had Congo and Rwanda. There's conflicts everywhere. And that, I think, is something which is part of the failure of the multilateral institutions to actually do the sort of job they were assigned after the Bretton Woods Agreement towards the end of the Second World War. And that, I think, is a new reality that we have to get used to. And we're moving away from what's conventionally called the rules-based international system to something which is really, what is mighty, might counts. I mean, I think to quote a Greek historian, Thucydides, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. And I think this is what we see at the moment, particularly, actually, in Ukraine. And I know that Ukraine will figure quite prominently in our discussions at this conference. We have to give tribute to how well Ukraine has done. Lots of questions about whether it could have done better with more help, for example, from the Biden administration. But that's a matter of judgment and opinion. There are arguments on either side. And then, of course, you have the old argument about, well, was Clinton right? Was George W. Bush right in basically dangling out the prospect of NATO to Central and Eastern European countries? And you can see it from, if you go back to Putin in 2007, I think it was, the Munich Security Conference, when he gave his vision. Now, that's not a vision that I share, and I don't agree with it, but I think we are sort of moving into an era of spheres of influence, and that I think is rather worrying, because that means you have to choose between a sphere of influence and another.
Well, some would try to choose to try to navigate between them and have it both ways, which is not easy. But Joan, from your point of view, and Joan, again, many of you will be aware, edits the Economist Intelligence Unit's Democracy Index, so you track the state of these things. Tell us briefly where you see the state of play is in the defense of democracy and the new order that we're in. And then I think we want to have a brief discussion about the economic implications of all this.
Yeah, very big question. In the blurb for this session, we ask, are we entering a new global paradigm? And I think that's probably too neat and tidy a word to describe the very disorderly state of affairs that we're living in. And I think we're living at a moment in a political and economic order which is in flux, and I would call it an interregnum. The old world is definitely dying, and the new one has not yet been born. And I think, Daniel, there's kind of four big trends that I would say are shaping this new order. I think the first one, importantly, is an erosion of belief in US leadership and hegemony and economic exceptionalism. Second, I think a greater recognition of the economic strength of China, which also has, importantly, a geopolitical and military dimension as well. Thirdly, the rise of the rest at the expense of the West, by which I mean, this big shift in the economic balance of power in the world over the recent decades, away from the West and towards the East. So we have a constellation of powers now that are competing for influence, some of which are status quo powers, you would call them, I guess. The US, the big European powers, plus Japan, plus South Korea, and then the non-status quo powers, which are challenging the old order. And I think finally, to bring it to the kind of economic dimension of all this, a very salient trend is what the trend everywhere towards economic nationalism and protectionism. And we might say that Trump is the most gung-ho protectionist, but he's far from being unique. And what we've seen over the past, really since the global financial crisis, is a trend increasingly towards nationalist, economic protectionist policies in every area: industrial policy, state interventionist policies, non-tariff barriers, tariffs, and so on. And I think, increasingly we're moving away from, market-type economies of old, and that reflects this disorderly world and the fragmentation of the global economic order, which I guess is characterized ultimately by increasing great power competition and rivalry, and that is what is driving this policy in that direction, which is not good news for the global economy and not good news for the European economy, I think.
So I think if you combine what both of you have said, you get a much more uncertain world, politically and in terms of power rivalries and in terms of the rules of the game and the system. Very briefly, because our time is very short, Joan, it's always useful at the start of these events to have some numbers from you, because you do the forecast for the EIU for Greece in particular, but also we could look at the world economy in Europe. What's the outlook for the coming year for world economy, Europe, Greece?
Well, the global economy is being subjected to, major shocks. Obviously, the tariff one, the kind of threat of a tariff war, major tariff war, and also geopolitical shocks as well, such as the recent war in the Middle East. And what that means is that that has created is tremendous uncertainty in the world, which I think the main impact of which is to depress spending both by businesses and by households, and that's going to have a pretty negative follow-through effect on growth globally and in Europe in particular. We're seeing that. So we're forecasting Eurozone growth of 0.9%, but the major economy in Europe, the German economy, is really struggling, facing very large near-term challenges, so hardly any growth of 0.1%, I think, is the forecast for this year. By contrast, Greece and the southern European economies are doing very well and have been doing very well. Growth has averaged 2.3% in Greece in 2023 to 2024, and the outlook is pretty much the same for the next few years, growth above 2%, and that's because tourism's been doing exceptionally well. We've had political stability, at least in Greece. We've had very sound fiscal and macroeconomic policies, some very effective and successful reforms, particularly in the taxation system, which has yielded very large revenue growth. Greece delivered a fiscal surplus. So the outlook is good. I guess the question for Greece, which is what we'll be discussing the next 2 days, is are these growth rates sustainable? And can Greece actually make the sort of transformational reforms that will raise the long-term potential growth rate, which most economists still see as around 1%. So Greece has been exceeding its long-term potential. Can that continue without some major, now radical reforms to make sure that over the long term, Greece really does continue to deliver that strong growth that we've seen in recent years?
Okay, well, I think that's enough from us by way of scene setting. That's really helpful. I would just point out, as a veteran of many years of these events, what a change this is, almost at every level, a change in the world, a world order that is being remade almost in front of our eyes, but also a change in Greece, because for many of the iterations of this event, we were talking about the tremendous problems of Greece, the crisis in Greece, and so on. And now it seems that Greece is a rare bright spot in this rather troubled global picture. So at least there's one thing to be cheerful about as we go into this period of examining the tightrope over the next 3 days. Thank you very much, Joan, and John will be back for more.